In Colombia, voters have rejected a peace agreement between the government and the nation's largest rebel group in a shocking turn of events that threatens to prolong the nation's 52-year-old civil war. By a razor-thin vote of 50.2 to 49.8%, Colombians rejected the peace deal hammered out with the FARC guerrilla movement and signed just days ago by Colombian President Juan Manuel Santos. It was a stunning upset for a referendum that was expected to pass overwhelmingly. In Havana, where peace talks have taken place over the past 4 years, FARC leader Rodrigo Londoño promised his movement would continue to work towards peace.
The FARC maintains its willingness for peace and reiterates its position to use only words as weapons to work towards the future. To the Colombian people who dream of peace, you can count on us. Peace will win out.
President Santos sent his negotiating team back to Havana for talks today and said a ceasefire with the FARC would remain in effect. Turnout in the referendum was low, less than 40% nationwide. Just 25% in some areas along the Caribbean coast hit with heavy rain from Hurricane Matthew. In Bogotá, many supporters of the peace deal wept as results came in.
I am Daniela Benavides. I am a law student, and I voted yes because I thought that Colombia was going to say yes to peace. No one thought that this was really going to happen. We were hopeful that we were going to live in a new country. We had hoped for so many things, but people just simply decided to continue with the war and continue with pain of more than 50 years and not think about us, the young people, nor all of the future generations. I know that this agreement wasn't perfect and that it had millions of points that obviously are not very good, but I prefer an agreement where some of the words are wrong instead of war where the bullets keep firing at people's heads.
Many of those voting no objected to the peace deal's offer of amnesty, limited immunity from prosecution, and reduced sentences granted to FARC rebels. Álvaro Uribe, the right-wing former president, led the no campaign, arguing rebels should not be allowed to re-enter society without facing punishment.
This gives impunity and eligibility to run for office to the highest leaders of the FARC, the largest cocaine trafficking cartel in the world.
Colombia's civil war began in 1964, has claimed some 220,000 lives. More than 5 million people are estimated to have been displaced. Joining us here in New York is Mario Murillo, a longtime Colombian activist, professor of communications at Hofstra University. He's author of Colombia and the United States, War, Unrest, and Destabilization. Can you talk about the significance of this no vote?
Well, I think we put too much weight on the plebiscite referendum to begin with, but it is significant. I mean, obviously, the Uribe camp and the supporters of the no vote, the ones who ended up winning by a slim margin, are calling it a victory and a demonstration of Colombian democracy. And in many ways it is. It's emblematic of Colombian democracy when you talk about high levels of abstention, which you pointed out in your introduction, when you talk about a major disparity between those rural areas most affected by the war, that voted overwhelmingly in favor of ending it, of saying yes to this peace deal, despite its problems. They voted yes, and the urban areas where for the most part they've been distant from the war and haven't lived it in carne propia, all the time, as directly as in the countryside, voted more in favor of no. And then finally, the fear, right? Why is Trump leading or now facing, possible election in this country? How did the Brexit situation happen in the UK? In Colombia, the intimidation and fear was so palpable, it was so strong, palpable in the media and in the coverage and what Uribe and his camp put out there, that it was almost inevitable that it was going to be this result. And I think part of the problem was that they put too much weight on the vote as opposed to pointing out, okay, what needs to be done to really put an end to this war.
And so what happens next? You have Santos, the president. This is a huge failure for him, saying he's sending the team back to Havana to negotiate, that he has to reach out more to Uribe and to the no forces. But he says the ceasefire will remain in effect, as the FARC say. So what does this mean?
Well, I think that's what everybody's hoping. I mean, yesterday there was devastation, and I was in Jackson Heights, Queens, in New York City. For listeners outside of New York, that's like the heart of the Colombian community in New York, and it was you could see the divisions there. You can see 60 people outside the polling place, 60, 70 people totally in favor of yes and 60 to 70 people on the other side of the street, separated by barricades and by police, totally in favor of no, and screaming, pretty hostile things at those in the yes vote, and that's the division that exists in Colombia, but the people in the yes side are insisting that this is not necessarily a victory for war, that we have to work harder to try to address the many problems that face Colombia right now. There's concerns, and this is something that's not being reported, is that the backlash has already begun against supporters of the yes vote and against the FARC. I mean, there was reports yesterday and during the week leading up to the referendum on Sunday that the right and the remaining members, the armed bands that still remain as former paramilitary groups that were demobilized under Uribe, where you didn't see the public outcry that we're seeing now with the FARC, that were saying that the minute these FARC rebels turn in their weapons, they're going to be considered criminal. They're going to be considered military targets, and that's not even being reported. The issue of what's going to happen subsequent to this accord. So I think we were putting too much weight on the accord and not on what's going to happen, whether or not it won in the vote. What was going to happen subsequent to that, and I think that's the thing that we should be paying attention to. What is happening in the countryside, the levels of intimidation against both former FARC rebels, if this process does continue to move forward, and the people who are in those areas that are supporting a cessation of hostilities.
Uribe made this a referendum on impunity for FARC, but what about the paramilitaries and the government, those forces that were so responsible for so many deaths?
I think the issue of impunity is a tough one because we keep focusing on impunity for the FARC, and this has to be pointed out that the peace deal was also talking about dealing with the soldiers and the military members of the public forces, the armed forces of Colombia that were involved in massive atrocities during this 50-year civil war. And nobody talks about them as getting off scot-free as well. Which is one of the issues. And the other issue is exactly what you're pointing out, that when Uribe negotiated a deal with the paramilitary groups, the right-wing groups that were working hand-in-hand with the armed forces in Colombia, carrying out a dirty war in the countryside for decades, massacring people, forcibly displacing millions of people, when that process was unfolding, there was no opposition. There was a lot of opposition, but you didn't hear Uribe and the right wing talking about impunity at that point. These people, Salvador Mancuso, the head of the AUC, walked into Congress and he got a standing ovation, right? And here they are concerned about giving 10 seats to the FARC as part of this peace deal in the Congress. That would only last, by the way, for 8 years. It would be a political process to allow them to insert themselves into the political life. So it's disingenuous at best, and it's just typical of the intransigence of the Colombian right. The right in Colombia doesn't cede anything without a brutal fight against those who are struggling for social justice. And unfortunately, that is now going to be pushed back even further because of this referendum.
Do you see the ceasefire holding? Will there be another referendum held? I mean, less than half of the population voted, less than 40%.
It's still unclear. I think the FARC, at least at the high command level, are totally convinced that they have to cease hostilities. The level of tranquility in some parts of the countryside is recognizable, and I think all sides are recognizing that we can't go back into war. My fear, again, and I think a lot of people are pointing this out, is that there's going to be acts of violence committed by both the right and by some remnants of the FARC and other guerrilla groups that are still operating in the country, that are going to be projected in the media as hostilities renewing at a level of what we saw 2, 3, 5 years ago. And the minute that happens, then the media, once again, we're going to see an onslaught saying, you see, these guys aren't serious. They're not serious about negotiations, that they're once again going at war. Even because there are members of the FARC who are, a small minority of the FARC that are still concerned about handing in their weapons and being part of this demobilization process. If they get into a firefight and carry out attacks especially from sectors of the right, it could get pretty ugly pretty quickly.
Mario Murillo, I want to thank you for being with us. Longtime Colombian activist and professor of communications at Hofstra University, author of Colombia and the United States, War, Unrest, and Destabilization.